John Candy, a man as sweet as his name. It's been written, he lived large, loved even larger, and the world loved him back in return. Now, 75 years after his birth comes a new biography of this legendary Canadian comic actor, a reminder of his remarkable legacy, made up of archival interviews and the testimonies of the lives he touched. And here to talk about it is John Candy, A Life in Comedy, is author Paul Myers. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
This isn't your first biography. You've written books about Bare Naked Ladies, Long John Baldry, Todd Rundgren, Kids in the Hall. So why a book about John Candy and why now?
Well, the Kids in the Hall book did fairly well for the publisher House of Anansi in Toronto, and they said, "Hey, we'd love you to do another comedy book." And I said, "Oh, let me do SCTV." That was like the next thing from the Kids in the Hall in my mind was, yeah, let's go all the way back to SCTV. And at the time, Martin Scorsese was doing a film about Second City Television that I thought perhaps would just take all the energy out of the room. So I said I couldn't do that. And then Doug, my editor, said, "Well, why don't you just do John Candy, and then you can talk about films like Planes, Trains, and Automobiles and Cool Runnings and all these things that are also part of that story that aren't SCTV." And I went, "Oh my God, can I do that?" And it was like a great moment where an editor gave me a suggestion, and I was like, I made it my own, because I brought my own experience to it, and I brought my own sort of passions for comedy and Canadian history and all those things.
It seems like there's a comic sensibility in forming Bare Naked Ladies, Kids in the Hall, and John Candy that kind of unites all these projects together.
That's a really good point. Yeah, yeah. There's definitely an irreverence, I would say, in the case of the Bare Naked Ladies. One of the things that attracted to me them as friends when I was playing with them in the Toronto scene was that they had a playful sense of humor. We all probably got it from Second City and John Candy. It was like those things were big impressionable things on people my age.
Well, let's dig into the book a bit here. John Candy was born, appropriately enough, on Halloween 1950, but as you put it, nothing about him particularly foretold of his evolution into one of the most highly regarded actors that Canada ever sent to the movie screens of the world. So, by all accounts, he had a relatively normal upbringing in suburban Toronto.
Yeah, I mean, other than the fact that his father died when John was 5 years old, he was raised by his aunt and his mother. And so he had a very strong matriarchal upbringing, and he had a brother named, so I'm forgetting the brother's name, but anyway, Jim. And then they grew up in North Toronto, sort of in between the suburbs and the city, probably an area that's now called the city of Metropolitan Toronto, actually. And he just went to the movies a lot, and played football and did normal things, and then I guess eventually his sense of humor started blossoming and his imagination because he watched a lot of movies and a lot of television. He started play acting in the backyard, which is many. If you read many biographies of actors, you'll see there's that moment where they have to try and go through the motions of what they just saw in the movie. And John was really good at that. He was good at drama too, which was surprising to me to find out.
Well, you touched upon it just now, but I think the pivotal event of his young life was losing his father at the age of 35. He's suddenly without a father, just 3 days shy of his fifth birthday. Um, would this sort of give him a fatalist view that he too would also die young?
That is what we kind of keep coming back to in the book. Again, I always make this point in interviews that I'm not a doctor and I can't analyze, especially someone who's not here. And I'm certainly not trained to be a therapist, but I would say that based on the anecdotal evidence of many interviews I've had and many interviews I've read, it seems that he was keenly aware of what people often call the sword of Damocles. This idea that eventually his number would come up. He thought it would come before 35, and he did live till 43. So in many ways, he did have that sword of Damocles. There is a history of heart disease in his family. His brother Jim had a heart attack, didn't pass away from that. But he had that modeled for him at a very early age that things you love could be taken away suddenly. And I think that, heck, I'm a big Beatle fan, and that hovered over Paul and John too. So the same thing about losing parents at an early age.
That not the older I get, a number like 43 seems impossibly young, and he packed a lot of life into those 43 years. Another observation is that he soon won friends with his secret weapon, a finely honed sense of humor. That seems to be the origin story of many a comedian or a comic actor.
Yeah, I think John liked to make the room. Liked to turn the vibes of a room into something, safe and friendly. And part of the way to do that, especially when you're a big man, he was a big target. He was always very tall, even before he gained a lot of weight. I think a lot of the times people use that to diffuse the situation, and he did have that, innate ability to be funny with people. And I think certainly helped him, especially when he didn't feel he was as good looking as some of the other boys. He could actually charm the ladies, the young ladies. And when he was a football star, he was the funniest guy on the team in high school. And then, of course, he had a knee injury that precluded him from playing professional sports or any kind of sports really that way. And the humor became super important then, and of course his theatrical skills. So he got to live out the lives of other people, and that gave him a sense of belonging, I think.
Now, John Candy comes up as part of this remarkable generation of young Canadian comedic talent. Set the scene for us. Who else was coming up around that same time in Toronto in the early 70s?
Well, it's convergence. I mean, there's been much talked about. There's this the musical Godspell had opened their first Toronto cast, and they brought out all these theater people like Eugene Levy and Martin Short and Andrea Martin, and they were all in town doing that. And they also had a sense of humor. Meanwhile, Second City Chicago has decided to open a Toronto office in 1973 or something, and they basically audition everybody, even from the Godspell cast, and they become the first cast of the Toronto Second City. In that cast, at one time or another, you had Catherine O'Hara, Gilda Radner, Dan Aykroyd, Dave Thomas, Joe Flaherty, eventually Robin Duke and different people like that. All of this generation of comedy, and and Eugene Levy, and these people would end up learning how to do improv comedy together. But it's also a uniquely Canadian spin on the Second City improv thing, because there's a very much a collective idea. Like they want no one person tried to step out in front of it. They all wanted the scene to work, which I think is kind of something Canadians do, I hope. And I think that they all trained each other to the point where they were among the only people who knew how to do these particular things. And if you've watched Christopher Guest films, you later realize that one of the reasons Eugene Levy and Catherine O'Hara end up being a big part of that is because they already had that sixth sense that you develop from doing that. And Dan Aykroyd speaks about it in my book, that it stood them well throughout the rest of their career, all of them, in different Saturday Night Live, in all these different places that they would take it. They all learned this thing together, and it ends up defining a generation of comedy. It's amazing.
Interesting to me as well as how you point out that the advent of SCTV was basically started to stop the brain drain from Second City Toronto to the original not ready for primetime players cast of SNL.
It's yeah, the specter of Lorne Michaels is all over this book because, Lorne is one of the first Toronto guys trying to do stuff in the States, and he finally gets, after being on Laugh-In and working on shows like that, he gets his own show on SNL, and he's first place he looks is Second City Toronto, and to get cast members, and that's where Aykroyd and Gilda, who also had gone to the National Lampoon Roadshow, it should be mentioned, but they get Belushi from there too. But this idea that Toronto talent was about to get raided, and SNL was a big hit, so it was obviously going to be a big temptation for the Toronto cast members to leave. So Andrew Alexander at Second City says, with Bernard Solins, who's co-managing the company, he says, we got to get on TV somehow. And anyhow, like they did it like literally on a shoestring budget. They got the smallest broadcaster in Canada, global, to let them use their facilities to make this TV show with very limited props and very limited costumes in the first season. And they were every season they were almost off the air. And of course they were portraying a TV station that was almost off the air. So it was a beautiful moment. Actually, I love that as a problem solving thing. Like to think, there's there's a term people use, flaunt the imperfections. If like I'm not a handsome man, so maybe I should just gurn some more and lean into my ugliness. There's this thing that happens. Conan O'Brien did it years later on his show. He had no money, so he made it fun. And originally David Letterman did the same thing. He was going to get canceled any minute, so just have fun. And I love that about Second City, and it really helped. They became different than Saturday Night Live. I think in many ways, some comedy fans I talked to think they did deeper and more interesting sketches. So it was great. They all lived together, but they were all doing separate things.
Now, John Candy becomes the breakout star of SCTV, but then he finds he has doubts about himself. But just then he starts getting film roles. You mentioned he's the cop in the Blues Brothers, and the whole scene with ordering orange whips, which I love that you just detailed that whole thing, the secret history of orange whips.
I
How
was
does
fascinated myself.
how does that all happen for him? How does that all come together?
Well, yeah. So basically, again, a guy like him, he gets a part in 1941. Spielberg sees him at a party. Comes to the party to meet SCTV people in Los Angeles. They're all there having a party, and Steven Spielberg buttonholes Candy and says, "I want to put you in 1941." His war movie wasn't a great movie, but it was a moment for John Candy to be picked out of the crowd. And then Stripes, and he gets to play Oxburger, which is like such a perfect role for him because he's the guy who joins the army to be a lean, mean fighting machine, and like he gets one of the nicest moments in the film, other than obviously Bill Murray and Harold Ramis, who are like the stars of the film. Candy gets once again a little standout role, just like the Blues Brothers, and he starts having standout roles, and then he gets kind of the co-lead in Splash with Tom Hanks, which at a time when Ron Howard hadn't proven his box office name, Tom Hanks hadn't done a name above the title picture, really. And so they were all just learning together. And Levy comes in on that. Eugene Levy comes in on Splash as well. And so by that point, people are starting to say John Candy should be in pictures. And then John Hughes comes along. John Hughes had done the teen comedies like The Breakfast Club and things like that. And now he wants to write films with adult characters in them. So what does he do? He sees something in John Candy, who had impressed him in National Lampoon's Vacation, doing another one of those scene stealing moments as the security guard at Wally World. Park. Sorry, folks, park's closed. Moose out front should have told you. And again, very Canadian character, by the way. But so this all comes together. So finally, John Hughes ends up being the songwriter, if you will, to this musician that is John Candy. And then you have Planes, Trains, and Automobiles and Uncle Buck, and to some degree, Only the Lonely. These films were all John Hughes productions that featured him, Candy, in the right light, that really, I think, defined his work in film. Those are the best films for John Candy.
Now, Candy, like many successful comic actors, had aspirations for more serious work. We see him exercise those acting chops in films like JFK and Only the Lonely. Do you think he was successful in showing he had that dramatic range?
Yeah, I think he did. I wish he'd done more. I wish he'd had a chance to do more. I mentioned in the book that Oliver Stone, on record at the time, said that this guy could be walking down the red carpet to get an Academy Award at some point. Like I always lately I've been presupposing that if he had done kind of what Robin Williams had done with Good Will Hunting, I feel like Candy had the dramatic range to do a film like that, where he could have done, a straight role with a killer emotional speech in it, and just, people would have been saying, let's give this man an Oscar. And he kind of didn't get those roles offered, and he had tried to make them happen, and eventually he was getting his own business together, and then life caught up with him, or in this case, death caught up with him, and he passed away far too early doing a film that he didn't really care about.
So he turns 40 in 1990, and as he gets older, you detail some of the health problems he goes through, a weight gain, increasing panic attacks, even imposter syndrome. Even as he was at the top of his game professionally, was this self-doubt always something that ate away at him? What brought this on?
Yeah, there's obviously, again, not being able to diagnose exactly what brought it on, but it seems to be from anecdotal evidence from him even saying it started to catch up with him. I think he was a people pleaser. This gets back to the idea of wanting to change the vibes in the room, as I was speaking earlier. He's constantly feeling responsible for people. He was responsible for his mother when he was, a little kid. He was the guy who drove his mother to buy groceries. He was always responsible for everyone else's mood and everyone else's vibe and everyone else's success. And he got success doing it. So there was this constant affirmation cycle of trying to please others and please yourself at the same time. And I think at a certain point, he really wanted to be genuine for the fans, which meant sticking around and shaking thousands of hands for 3 hours and then being exhausted by it and having to have genuine moments with everybody. And he didn't, I don't know, maybe the psychology of celebrity these days, people are better trained for it. But this was the 80s, and I think a lot of things were new territory. Like it said the same thing happened to the Beatles. They didn't know how to handle Beatlemania, where other bands might have gone on 10 more years, but the Beatles had to be over in five practically. And so the same thing happened to Candy in the 80s, I think.
I like how it kind of comes back to the Beatles with you and your brother because of the whole Liverpool connection.
It's going to, yeah. It's in our blood. Yeah, yeah. No, I don't think a day goes. I'm in a Beatles Zoom club with people. There's a bunch of grown men and a few women that talk about the Beatles every Sunday. It's a private little club, and we love it. It's like a Zoom. It's like an old COVID era thing. We basically all there's screens in front of us, and we're all talking about what the newest Beatle news is. So anyway, yeah, that's definitely a big part of my DNA.
Just as an aside, is it true that you guys thought you were related to the Beatles until a certain age?
Yeah, yeah, that's something both of us have talked about in interviews. Because my father sounded on the phone like John Lennon. He's like, son, I just wanted to tell you to come home early. We're having living onions tonight. Like it was just like, and when you're a kid and you only have one other person in the world that talks like that, and it's the Beatles. And they told me stories about Liverpool and their streets that, when they heard Penny Lane, they said, "Oh, we used to go to Penny Lane all the time." And like, you went to Penny Lane, which to me, as a kid in Toronto, was a mythical. It was like saying they went to Narnia. Like I used to go to school in Narnia. Like it was like, and it was very much the land of our parents, and so everything about the Beatles sort of made us connected. I think, and I've only recently in the last 20 years realized that's part of the reason the Beatles deeply affected me is because I felt like it was a connection with my parents. I just want to say one more thing. When my father passed away in the 90s, we cremated him and took his ashes to the Mersey River in Liverpool. And we rented a boat and took his ashes out as he requested to be scattered in the Mersey River, which is illegal, and I'm sorry. We rented a guitar and I sang "In My Life" by John Lennon on the boat as my father's ashes hit the water. So, I mean, it doesn't get more primal than that, right?
Now this book seems as well. It seems to be a low-key love letter to Toronto. The whole thing about the Argonauts and John Candy's ownership of them, and how he'd always come back to the city, and of course the references to Johnny Toronto, which I love. How much of a role do you think Toronto plays in his origin story?
I think that it certainly plays a big part in that Argos period because I know that, as you quote there, that a lot of the people who worked with him at the beginning of his career in Toronto kept saying he wants to own this town. He wants to be Johnny Toronto. And then there's this great scene when he is walking through the Sky Dome and the Toronto Argonauts are playing, I think, a home opener or something like that. And everyone's cheering because Candy's brought some pizzazz back to the Argos and to the CFL, frankly. And different people in the book claim to have said this, but Aykroyd or Dave Thomas said, "Look at him, he's Johnny Toronto finally." And that was almost the working title of the book. But I lived in Vancouver long enough a few years ago to realize you don't want to put the word Toronto on a book that's going to be sold outside of Toronto. So, not so much anyway. But it's a big part of this story. It's definitely for him. He always kept a place north of Toronto, even when he had a place in Hollywood. His family knows Toronto winter. Like he's definitely a son of the city, so there's no denying it. And certainly that's how people feel about him back in Toronto, actually.
Having studied John Candy's life in full, what do you think his legacy is? Is he still influential today?
Yes, I discovered that a whole bunch of people like Josh Gad, who was in the Book of Mormon, and Ben Stiller, they all talked about how for them, it's the way the generation before used to speak of Jackie Gleason or people who were big but carried themselves with emotional weight as well. And there's a certain style of comedy acting. It's not just the physical thing too, because there's something that Candy did. He played little guys. Like I don't mean small in stature, but he would play like, people who were salesmen and people who were cops and rank and file people. And I think that kind of comedy, when you're doing that, like a Kevin James or a Patton Oswalt, those people know they know that there's a guy who did this in the 80s. There's a guy who did this before them. I think there's a certain kind of dramedy that is popular in streaming and everything that I think Candy would have excelled in. I think I often say that he might have been a great HBO star as a bumbling detective or something, and he also would have been on Schitt's Creek for sure.
There's a lot of heart to his roles, like in Uncle Buck and the "I like me" speech from Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. Uh, what do you hope people take away from the book?
I I always think whenever I do anything, people will realize why I asked them to spend the time reading this, and why I spent the time writing this, and one of the things that I think it came to me only later is we live in a time when, let's be honest, some of the people at the top, particularly in the American government, don't have a lot of empathy and compassion, or they're not acting it out. If they do, they're not showing us. And guys like Candy represent the best of us. Guys like Candy represent people who tried really hard to bring joy and compassion and empathy in their work, but also in off camera. Like he was, so he's a great model for that kind of aspirational, just being a good person. Who was it? Ryan Reynolds actually said, he said, I was finally got to talk to Ryan Reynolds recently, and he's a big fan also, and he said he was good even when no one was looking. And I think that is one of the best things you can be, I think. And I certainly like to think so. I mean, it taught me stuff. I realized that I was actually trying to be a better person after I wrote this book, which is, thanks for that gift, John,
I mean, you couldn't ask for a better legacy, I guess.
Yes, it's certainly that's something you want for sure.
The name of the book is John Candy, A Life in Comedy. It is published by Anansi Press. My thanks to author Paul Myers.
Thank you so much.